Hey, ReFi Nation, Simar here from the ReFi podcast. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Ashley from Resource Finance. Resource is taking the very ancient behavior of bartering and mutual credit and creating a set of tools and protocols to enable this to happen at a community and local level at scale. In today's episode, we'll be unpacking a little bit more about what Resource is, hearing more about Ashley's story, and really looking ahead to seeing what do regenerative economic systems really look like? What happens when we start to shift what we value and how we value, and how we have systems that really support that inquiry and that curiosity and that questioning. There's a lot to look forward to in today's episode. We hope you enjoy. Sending lots of love. And with that, here's the episode. Hey, what's good, ReFi Nation? We are here with our dear guest, Ashley from Resource. Ashley, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great here in Nairobi, and it's the end of a nice day here.
That is great to hear. Wow, we've got so much exciting, so many exciting things to cover on Resource, your own personal journey. Could you just share a little bit about what Resource is and a little bit of a context and a background around the underlying network and protocol?
For sure. So Resource is a system that we created that takes this old idea, which is called mutual credit, or otherwise known as multilateral exchange, multilateral barter. And we took some core principles of this idea, which are around how do you create a currency where no one has any pre-existing currency in the first place, but they do have time, they do have productive capacity, they have skills, they have things that they can offer. And it's a system that basically facilitates exchange where we don't need cash, but we just need to be part of these types of networks. Of course, we didn't come up with that idea, but we invented a way to allow that idea to be more accessible and to be more sophisticated using what we know about traditional finance so that we can solve some problems, which are basically like, how do you deal with the fact that sometimes these sort of networks may experience something like someone defaulting? So we sort of have thought through all of those potential use cases, including how do all of these different networks exchange amongst each other. So there's a lot more I can say about sort of the future that we're envisioning based upon that, but to simplify it, what we as a team are focusing on is the fact that a ledger, a distributed ledger, enables us to think of currency and capital in a fundamentally different way. And it means that we don't need to think about how did we perform in the existing system. We need to start to think about how do we create new opportunities for people in new systems and reward this type of behavior and create whole new incentive structures. So in terms of us as a team, that's the types of things that we're thinking about in terms of what we want to build and the types of projects that we want to help come to life.
Very cool. And there's going to be a lot that, I think we can unpack there. A lot of really, really interesting, I think, from an economic design perspective on how people can be in relationship with another. But before we do, why don't we just, I'd love to hear a little bit more to start about your maybe personal journey. What led you to coming to Resource? Give us a little bit of a context and, give us a little window into what was Ashley's journey to this point right here.
Yeah, sure. So my journey, I guess I would bring about 10 years ago to being in college and studying a whole bunch of different economic systems. And that was in the field of cultural anthropology, or at least that's where I started to identify the types of systems that I was interested in exploring. And I started to put together the fact that it seemed that a lot of the big systemic problems that we faced as a society had their roots in the design of our economic systems. And because I identified that fact for myself, I was not drawn to the field of economics as being sort of the place where we were going to find new answers. So I looked into culture anthropology, started studying systems of the past, and then from that perspective, started looking at where are there different experiments going on around the world, where we're looking at value in different ways, not just in the past, but today. And so that led to a grant at a think tank that was funded by Warren Buffett's son, Peter Buffett, and his wife, Jennifer. And they were focused on how do you basically stimulate grassroots culture to create new types of social change. And our task at that think tank was to look at different models around the world that we thought held the recipe that could be scaled to provide systems that were alternatives to the ones that were more destructive that we were experiencing in modern days. So I'm in this kind of space. I find out about Bitcoin. This is like 2013. Bitcoin itself was not the sort of community that inspired me initially. Although I recognized there was something happening there that was interesting. Then the Ethereum white paper comes out, and I'm living in New York City. I went to a meetup about the Ethereum launch, and I recognized that there was a lot of potential in the design of Ethereum to basically provide a scalable system to a lot of these very small sort of economic prototypes that I was doing in my research. So taking a step back from that for myself, I started to think about what does a scalable system look like? And essentially the system is you contribute to a community, the community finds what you're doing valuable, you earn some sort of currency, and you can use that within the community, right? Like that's the basic concept behind resource, behind mutual credit. And feeling that that was something I wanted to work on, I also recognized it was really, really early to actually develop that type of a project. And so I got involved with Joseph Lubin as his first employee and started to help build the early consensus conglomerate, we can call it. And so that in the early stages meant how do you think about what are the core pieces that are going to be brought to life in this early Ethereum ecosystem. And again, this was a super cool role in the sense that I'm kind of learning what's going to be developed by helping coordinate amongst different people who want to build upon Ethereum, getting sort of our access to what is this ecosystem going to look like, you know, as a community. So in terms of then my journey from this level was realizing that the things that I want to build were too early to be built. And so I helped facilitate organizing community in different projects. And there's like a whole nother journey now after this. But I think in terms of, you know, maybe we'll shorten it to say that there came a time where there was infrastructure, where it was time to build this project. And then that was the origin of Resource in its modern form.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like there's like such a beautiful thread of curiosity, you know, like just like continuing and continuing, living in the future from actually a very early time of like, what could this possibly be and what could this mean? I'm curious, what was that initial insight? You know, because I feel like I went through something very similar in 2018, actually. SEP was the one, you know, SEP gave me Sacred Economics and Ascent of Humanity from Charles Eisenstein. And it was like, I was like looking at early childhood education. I was looking at all these different systems and I was like, oh, upstream is our underlying economic system and how money flows. And I feel like that was, you know, really begin when the veil started to pull. I'm curious, what for you was that initial insight into like, actually, I need to look as far back and upstream as, wait, the economic system isn't actually working for what we have going on, you know, and that's actually like the source of what's, you know, what we're experiencing here.
Yeah, I think for me, it was I was in, you know, a nice college. I went to Duke and I saw all of the opportunities around me to basically have whatever career I wanted, you know, it seemed like, and I wasn't inspired by a lot of that.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at why I wasn't inspired, it was because I felt that a lot of the systems that people were building and contributing to were ones that were sort of perpetuating these cycles of creating opportunities that were beneficial for a few to kind of maintain their sort of status quo and weren't trickling down. And I think that was a sort of core intuition I had, but then I turned to systems like culture anthropology and different teachers in my school that I started to study different ways of are there alternative sort of methods of organizing ourselves? And then I think as a secondary part of this, I've always had a sort of like spiritual practice or spiritual development. And that led me to looking into ways that we've organized ourselves in the past where, we didn't have this like separation of church and state that we have today. And not to say that that's what I'm advocating for, but more to say that, in communities of the past, we had cultures that were much more organized around systems of making meaning. And that was what underlays what we value together as a collective, underlies what we value as a collective. And so given that I think that now we're in this very like interesting abstract place of there's so many different systems that are possible, but yet because there's so much possible, it's very hard for the average person to then identify what's actually valuable to them. And I think that sort of line of curiosity, as you say, led me to say that there's other systems where we've identified what's valuable. And I maintain sort of that perspective in terms of where we are in the world of developing new value systems. It's not just about, does this thing look stable in comparison to the way that we've understood stability in the past 100 years? Or is it more this whole wide open, Wild West experimentation with how do we create communities that value things that are actually valuable to ourselves beyond just this like very narrow idea of monetary value? And so that was sort of the inkling that led me to thinking about this in the first place.
Very, very cool. I love that. That is like such a powerful, the multidimensional nature of value. And I think, to without going too deep into like the financial system, like it is, I feel like, so much of it has been organized very much trickle down. Economics is like a very core part of that, of like banks lending down, like all these filters of who gets access to capital and who gets to be included in the economic system. That it's like, what happens when we flip the paradigm? What happens when we go grassroots and think about what communities value within themselves, right? And like start to really support and anchor that. Super, super cool. And there's like so many, I feel like, streams that we can go here. Why don't we actually start to like come in back into resource? And I would love to hear maybe even just some of the like, how did that come to be? What is the origin story of like, you've got you and David. How did that come to be? How did that come into like beginning the early forms of the protocol and the network?
Yeah. So resource, again, like our team and what we're building, we were not the first ones, I think, to start to think about how do you basically incentivize barter-backed currencies to come to life on the blockchain. It seems, at least to me, a very intuitive idea in the beginning of blockchain, because essentially you have the ledger, so you can keep track of who's doing what. So you don't need any pre-existing currency in the first place. You just need a way to keep track of how do we understand that did you actually provide the value that you say that you're providing, and is the ledger actually reflecting that? And so the origins of the idea for me were actually, okay, intuitively that makes sense. But now the blockchain that we have, which at the time, Ethereum, how are regular people going to get ETH? And that was a question I started to ask myself in 2015, doing research with farmers in upstate New York. And that question caused me to take a step back and say, this is not the right architecture at this point in time to build this system, because farmers aren't going to spend the time or have the resources to acquire ETH to be able to put their transactions on the blockchain. And now here we are, 7 8 years later, we have this whole other ecosystem where now it makes a lot more sense to build something, right, that those farmers are using. And so practically speaking, the journey of creating something that I think is enabling sort of cashless exchange has actually taken a lot of time, to get to this point, because we needed a lot more infrastructure to be developed and a wider ecosystem to be developed. So because I realized this in like 2015, and also at the same time, I recognized that it was going to take a while for the crypto space to get to a point where myself as an entrepreneur wanted to contribute in terms of creating this project. Because basically at the time, I'm in this role in this like large organization that's growing, and that's actually never been my intention, right? Like I'm trying to create something from the ground up. So I decided to take a step back and explore what else I can do as an entrepreneur. So I created a community space in New York City and helped sort of provide some different experiences and educational classes for folks in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And then started to sort of prototype out what this sort of resource barter system would look like. Doing this, and then someone else, David Casey, actually starts building a very similar system, calling it the same name. And we get connected and decide that, it's something that is bigger than both of our original ideas. And that's sort of been always the story of Resource. Each person that we've brought into the team has added something that wasn't there originally. Yeah. And that's, I think, the beauty of building in these open source blockchain ecosystems is if you're creating these sort of frameworks and then people are starting to come in and add sort of more sophisticated ways of thinking about it. And so the idea has evolved so much since the beginning. I would say on this journey, what was interesting to me was the development of the Celo ecosystem, which is not something that, I was watching or paying attention to because I had taken a step back. And the Celo ecosystem started to say what I would call more of a values-led approach to blockchain development, whereas a lot of other blockchains, I would say, take more of like a technical-based approach to blockchain development. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it added this other dimension into the ecosystem, which was something that was important for me and my work, because now we're not talking about the long term, but we're saying we needed at least a foundation to start to prototype upon. And that's what I think the Celo ecosystem has done really well, is saying there's going to be a future where these things need to exist. Because we know these things need to exist, we're going to provide some infrastructure that's not actually thinking about the long term, which is like very different than like the Ethereum based approach, right? Which is like this has to work at scale and it cannot break and it cannot be exactly. So that was like something that changed for me as an entrepreneur. I was like, okay, this makes sense now to start to build and prototype upon. So that was the basic journey in terms of the formation. There's a whole nother level of, what happens after we come together. But yeah, it was a pretty cool few years.
That is amazing, Ashley. There's such a beauty, I think, to the journey. And I feel like there's a lot of, I feel like one of the things that we've seen even through the podcast is like, I feel like there's, for many listeners, for many people that are coming into the refi space, there's, a combination of a personal journey, a sort of waking up to how things could be, and then a sort of like, great, like, how do we tell the stories and come together around what's possible and start to create around that sort of new reality? So I'd love to, take some time now to actually like go deeper into the unpack, resource. Let's just start maybe with some basic terms. What is mutual credit? Can you just, get for the layman's, like, what is mutual credit? How does it work? And can we maybe even give an example of how that might work in a system? And then we can sort of build up from there, the entire resource ecosystem. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. So mutual credit is essentially a system that allows you to exchange goods and services without needing money. How do you do that? So say that there's 3 of us that are part of a system. A system can be as big as small as you want it to be, 2 people to billions of people, right? And within the system, if I want to access something from you, like if you are a teacher and I want to get some teaching services from you for like website development, I'm able to do that by basically sending you some credits. And those credits are
Mm-hmm.
something that now you can use to spend with someone else within the network. So you can think of it as though you and I are bartering, but the
Yep.
difference is you don't have to want what I'm able to provide because someone else in the community will be, or the network will want to receive what I have. So that idea, again, is not something we invented. What we have done is say, there's issues with these networks at scale, right? Like, what if someone in the community doesn't want something that I have to provide? So we basically build all these mechanisms to say, well, maybe there's ways to exchange into other types of currencies, or maybe
Yeah.
you can exchange with other types of networks. The other kind of problems that we solve are, what if there's someone who gets let into the network that actually wasn't able to provide what they said they're able to provide, and we're able to
Mm-hmm.
kind of deal with that sort of currency management and basically get to a point where there's always sort of a healthy, stable currency.
Yeah. Giving a specific example. So like, let's say, for example, Ashley, I have a super special, I like to make chai. Like, I make a really good tea and you really want that tea. And so I'm like, hey, here's like let's say a pack, a bottle, or let's say I'll give you a cup of tea, and then you issue me, and this is just to like, you are issuing me credits. So let's say, for example, it's like 5 credits. So how does that happen then? So I'm
Yep.
giving you the tea. Yeah, go forward from here.
Yeah. So just imagine the ledger, right? So
Yep.
imagine that we have a book in between each other, and we're going
Yep.
to both cross off on the book. You have 5 credits,
Yeah.
and I have -5 credits. Now, the
Gotcha.
difference is that book, it's not just shared between you and I, right? That book is now something that a wider network of people are accessing. So now I have this
Yeah.
-5, but someone else comes to me and they
Yep.
want to purchase like some
Yep.
salon services that I'm providing. So that -5 is basically something that can turn into +20 if they pay me 25 credits. And that's essentially
Yeah.
how it works. So it's like, when you explain it, it sounds so simple, right? It's like, that's how money works.
Yeah.
But the important part to remember is we didn't need any money to get started. We just started providing goods or services.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think in the West, maybe this seems like, well, why would you need that? But I'm based here in Nairobi, and we're launching a project here with folks in informal settlements. And
Mm-hmm.
constantly a problem here is not having access to cash in the first place.
Yeah.
We have lots of people who have extra productive capacity, not enough opportunities to be able to apply that. So you're now providing this tool that allows transactions to happen that otherwise would never have happened in the first place.
That is so powerful. And so just like, it's almost as if the creational authority of money and currency comes back to the grassroots individual. It's like, it's not anybody's giving you credits then give to me. It's like, no, you can create this credit that then, like, I know, for example, on the ledger is like recorded and then can sort of like, in your point, multilaterally now at scale, be able to start to interact. If like we're in a community, somebody might have something that you want, and then I might have some, there might be something that someone else has that I want that I can now use my credits to then be able to do. How do you, how do you prevent, or how do you think about, so for example, in this case, right, Ashley, where let's say gave you something that you wanted, and now I have a credit and you have a debit. How do you prevent, or what happens in the situation where you just leave the community with the debit? Like, you're like, great, like I took what I wanted and now I'm not going to provide back and I'm just going to exit with this debit in the system.
Yeah. I mean, so that is a question that can be answered on many layers. We'll start
Mm-hmm.
with the social layer, which is that most of these networks will be started in communities where there are already relationships amongst peers, and there's already reciprocal relationships of exchange. So what does that mean? That means if you're a member of this community and then you exit, other people know who you are, and so
Yeah.
they understand that that's actually not, or sorry, you understand that that's not something that you really want to be associated with yourself and your reputation. So I think social barriers are the
Yep.
number one influence of this. Second, you could say the lack of utility, right? So now, if this is a system that your community has adopted and you're in a position where you're not providing anything, now you're not able to access what other people are providing. So that's another sort of layer. Third, we get into more of the programmatic stuff, which is in our system, if you enter into whatever is defined as default, there's a mechanism for burning excess currency within the system, which just basically means there's going to be other people within the system who maybe have too much of the currency. They can send those credits to be burned, and they're going to be paid for that service. And that's like a whole concept, which we call a savings pool. So we'll just say that's like a very simplified way of saying that. And then, of course, there's other things that you could do in different networks where you could say you have to put up some sort of even collateral to be able to access the system. I don't think that's actually the most efficient way to get something started, because I think the whole point is bootstrapping liquidity and saying that, honestly, most people are going to be good payers. So why don't you just model default into your business model and focus on providing liquidity and making sure that you're protecting yourself in that instance where this does happen. Yeah,
exactly. Right. And I'm assuming too, there's also like, it seems like trust is an important, sort of to your point, the social bonds are a part of the fabric that's holding the community, the ecosystem together. And so it's like, for example, there might be also provisions where if you as someone are providing good service, like you may choose selectively to also, like, as opposed to a stranger coming to the system, maybe it's like you engage with the community. And I'm sure it seems like the social fabric here is an important part of how the goods and services might maybe flow, right? And like provisions to prevent, the sort of like person coming in, extracting value, and then exiting the system, that is not actually plugged into the social fabric.
Exactly.
Cool. So now that we've got some building blocks in place, why don't we start to are there communities on the ground where you've seen this now begin to play out? How does an economy like this actually come off the ground? What are the initial goods and services that you guys have found to be an important part of that initial liquidity?
Yeah. So in terms of the system in and of itself, it could be applied in many different ways. So I would bucket the types of partners that we're working with into 3 different categories. So the first is communities that don't have good access to traditional finance or traditional credit. That's our primary focus because, there's lack of options. So there's just a real problem to be solved. And second to that, there's a lot of potential because traditional finance is not able to solve that problem because the cost of credit is too high. And a lot of credit just becomes too extractive to be something that we want to support, as a society. But also on top of that, it's not even helping the problem it's trying to solve in the first place, which is helping businesses and folks grow, right? So in terms of those communities, the types of things that are most important are basic needs. Basic needs, anything from food to childcare to shelter to toilets, all the types of different things that you would need to provide on a daily basis. So that's like one sort of type of use case where we're focusing. And again, that's our primary use case. The second type of category we can talk about are these existing trade and barter networks. So this will range from anything from similar networks that I just described to sort of like local communities, to larger sort of corporate barter exchanges. And within that paradigm, again, it varies, but because of the circular nature of these networks, basic needs are always something that's prioritized. But then each network will have sort of different flavors. So you could imagine sort of like a corporate barter network of advertising and publishing that could be built using the system, and something that we've explored. So there are these types of networks too, where we're already having some sort of idea of barter. How do we basically make this more efficient? And that's sort of where our protocol is coming in. And then in the third type of use case, we're looking into things like supply chains where we have a lot of different players. There's sort of a circular value flow.
Yep.
But we are having this kind of one centralized operator who's playing this credit function.
Yep.
So how would
Yep.
we actually distribute that system more broadly? This one we haven't fully explored yet, although we have a few partnerships that we're starting to tap into.
Cool. Lovely. I love that. It seems like there's some level of like, how do you grassroots communities that have maybe been underserved actually get them, it's like unlocking the community from a grassroots perspective, right? Giving them the economic tools that they need to actually begin to productively engage, it seems like with one another, but through the creation of literally through their own currency, being able to port existing trade networks. And then it seems like maybe some of these pieces around supply chain that are also just interesting as well. With these communities on the ground, I know you mentioned, being in Nairobi right now, what have you seen? What is it like to actually like get this off the ground? What have been some of the hurdles? What have been some of the learnings as you've been like actually going from, practice or theory of what's possible and how people can engage now into practice? What have you been learning and seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I think so. We started in the US actually last year, and I'll say what we learned from that perspective. And in the US, what we learned is um, there's a lot of sort of inherent adoption of how the traditional financial system works to the point that doing something different is
Yeah.
seen as a luxury rather than seen as like a necessity. Although I think
Yeah.
that will change in the next few years, if not in the next 1 to 2 years. And so I think that we as a team decided that we're much more interested in working in places where this is seen as a necessity rather than sort of a privilege.
Yeah.
And that point just being that even if the traditional financial system in the US or the West, it doesn't work for everyone. Yes, that's very true. But for a lot of people, it pretty much works. And so a lot of the challenge and the resistance that we've seen is that this is just a little bit too intellectual or forward thinking than someone's day-to-day needs. And for us, and I think this is something the crypto space has struggled with and still struggles with, right? And I think on top of that, that's why crypto has been pigeonholed in sort of a mainstream perspective as an investment tool. And that's really not what it's about. And actually, I don't think any of sort of the core founders and builders would say that that's what it's about, right? But it has this whole different perception because of that market. And so for us, we decided to make a decision to focus on like those types of use cases where what does it look like to have a really sort of traditional system emerge with whole new tools. And that's, what we prioritize. So now in sort of new environments, what are the challenges that we face? It's not really any different. It's the same. It's just you have to spend a lot of time doing the same thing over and over again, which is education. Is that a challenge? No, it's just more that that's not traditionally what we've thought of when we're building sort of tech or these types of companies. So I think like that's something that is new to Web3, which is your strategy always has to focus on educating around basic concepts. And also that's what's beautiful about it, because you're actually helping people unlock potential for themselves and seeing what they can do with it, right? Rather than just saying, here's this one product and here's this way you can use it. And rather saying, here's a system, how might you apply it? So I think the challenge though, as a team or as a project comes into how do you fund yourself to continue to do this type of work, knowing that this is a long-term play? And of course, a lot of teams take approaches which are, well, we'll just do this little short-term thing and launch this little token and make a little bit of money and like, we'll figure that out later, right? That's one strategy, and not to knock it because plenty of good projects have done that and then went on to develop cool things. And I could name a lot, but I'm not going to. But saying, so that's like one approach. Another approach is to say, how do you get kind of scrappy and fund yourself to continue to build in a way that you're not going to understand how to maximize value in the beginning but you're opening yourself up for a whole different type of ecosystem where a ton of
Yeah.
value can be created, right? And
Yep.
so that is the hugest challenge, I think, for projects like ours,
Yeah.
which are trying to say that there's different ways that we can utilize, currencies and finance. And so that's a whole nother topic. I think I'll be able to share more maybe in like 2 years if I've successfully actually figured it out. But that's definitely the top of mind
Yeah.
sort of North Star for us and our team, is to make sure that we preserve our creative potential by not sacrificing the time we have now to worry about stupid shit, honestly, and be able
Yeah.
to think about what can we actually do. So
Yeah. What have been the things that you've needed to educate around? What have been like the key things that, you've noticed as themes is like, hey, we really needed to put attention on education here.
yeah, so in terms of our system, because it's basically this idea of mutual credit that we're describing, and we
Hmm.
don't talk about blockchain, we don't talk about crypto, we use M-Pesa as transaction fees, which is mobile money here that everyone uses. So
Hmm.
our education is very much like, imagine that you have sort of your M-Pesa wallet. Imagine you have this other app that is allowing you to exchange within your community. The only difference is you didn't go to your M-Pesa agent and load your phone with money. You just started offering your goods and services to the community.
Yeah.
So the challenge is not the concept for most people. It takes a little bit of time to explain. Um, but in these communities, people do have time, actually. And that's sort of the point, right? Is saying people do have time to do things and learn new things. So I would say for us, the challenge is not in people understanding the concept or anything like that, not in understanding the
Hmm.
value. It's just literally like, how do we get enough people to understand the value, just because it takes time to do that. So one of the ways
Yeah.
that we're going to mitigate that is having sort of trusted agents that onboard people within different communities, and they are incentivized to do this and are then providing sort of educational seminars and workshops and places for people to learn about these concepts.
Very cool. Love that. That's very, very cool. So just now maybe orienting towards the future. So resource, you've building out these mutual credit networks, supporting communities, it basically taking the function of barter and now leveraging, distributed ledger technology to now make that much more transparent and, create the tools to make that actually flow easily. What's ahead? What's the big, what's the vision, the thing that's exciting you? Like, the like, what is the grandest vision of what this could possibly be?
Yeah, so I think we break it down into phases, and this is just practically speaking. I think the first phase is us really understanding how does it grow as a significant amount of value in certain
Mhm.
places where there's not traditional access to credit. So I would call
Yep.
that something to 20% to possibly 50% of people's transactions, right, that are possible in places where traditional credit doesn't exist. So we see that as a big goal. And what does that actually look like in certain communities? When we sort of get to a place that we understand, we'll call this success, we'll call this thriving, within that 20 to 50% range. What does that look like? Then, what are the tools for anyone else to start these sort of community mutual credit currencies within their own networks, and then don't require us as the team being there to facilitate that? What does that
Yeah.
whole tooling infrastructure look like? So that'll be sort of like phase two. This is approaching it kind of from the grassroots level. From the grassroots level, then phase three is you are part of many different networks. Maybe you live
Yeah.
in Nairobi and you live in one neighborhood and you work in another neighborhood, and there's fluid exchange amongst all of these. Sort of a fourth level of partnership now is traditional and crypto fiat lending. So now you have this like reputation within these
Hmm.
different mutual credit networks. That's actually now a way for you to get access from fiat capital and to be able to move fluidly between both. So those aren't all in chronological order, but that's how we're thinking about it in these types of markets. If we would talk about it from a higher level, I would say there's lots of use cases, even in more of like traditional corporate exchanges, where we have a lot of circular. Well,
Hmm.
actually, let me say this in a different way. We have a lot of linear supply chains that we could make more circular.
Yeah.
That is a huge, big task. That is something that I think mutual credit can really solve, which
Yep.
is how do we transition our traditional systems? Well, we need credit to do that. How do we get to credit to do that in a sense where traditional credit isn't able to fund that? We can use these sort of like new mutual credit systems. That's sort of a big
Hmm.
picture idea. What that actually looks
Yeah.
like, of course, it will be
Yep.
pilots that we do and then grow and scale. And I think the final thing I'll say about this is the grand vision, again, is coming back to earlier in the conversation, helping people get access to the tools to help us as a community experiment with what value actually is and what
Yeah.
types of economies and communities we actually want to create, rather than
Yeah.
sort of accepting these systems that have been imposed upon us as the only thing, and
Yep.
like inspiring more people to be able to participate in what that looks like. And that I think is more where we're trying to get as a project, but of course first trying to understand
Yeah.
what are the tools we need to get to that place in the first place.
Yeah. I love that. And I think there's like I love that point too. That like, I feel like our traditional economy is very linear. It's like inputs, outputs, opacity. Like it's very opaque every step of the way. And it's very extractive, almost like fire burning, and I think the mutual credit system, it feels like, is naturally circular by design. It lends itself to circular flows. And so it's almost like a creative constraint where it's like, great, like if you have that kind of a system, what kinds of sustainable ways of transacting then actually start to emerge from that point? I think it's a really powerful seed question. As we start to, come to like the close of our time together, I'd love, to your question about value. Maybe you could just speak to what you value and like what you really want to see in community, and how your maybe notions of value have also expanded. It seems like there's been a personal journey here too, but just like, what do you value now and what are you excited to see going forward?
Yeah, so the concept this year I've been excited about is the idea of leisure, and leisure being, in terms of a Greek word, around the idea of having time to explore your curiosity. And I think that is the, I think, biggest goal that I hold for lots of folks around the world, right? Is like being able to have this time and space for yourself to say, what actually is it that I'm interested in? Of course, I would add to this for myself. There's like a certain amount of discipline, like body, mind, spirit, right? It's not all time spent doing just that. But I think being able to find ways that you're developing your own internal curiosity and being supported in that, from classes to like personal time to group time and sort of group think and group debate. So those are the things that I hold very dear for myself.
I love that. Beautiful. Well, as you know, I know we sort of talked about some of the partners that you have been working with. For all of the listeners that are tuning in today, are there ways that people can get supported, can support you guys, get involved? What are the most helpful things right now to help get Resource off the ground?
Yeah, for sure. So our website is resource.finance, and there you can find all the different ways to connect with us on the different social channels. In terms of where we are for the next 6 months, it's solidifying a few more partnerships that help us exemplify what's capable with our system. And so definitely folks who have existing fintech platforms or existing networks of businesses or trade organizations or local currencies, whatever that looks like, those are things that we're interested in supporting at this point in time. So please get in touch with us. And in general, if that's not something that is available right now, within the next 6 to 12 months, there'll be other ways that people can plug into the community that aren't about launching specific networks, but are more about how do they support networks that are already existing, or how do they provide liquidity to help facilitate exchange between networks, things like that.
Amazing. Well, so grateful, so grateful for our time. It's been such a fun conversation. Amazing. Thank you so much, Ashley, for coming on. It's been a joy to have you on the ReFi podcast.
Yes, thank you, Simar. This is a great conversation.